first off, I want to thank all of you for coming. It is the first session of the day, and if you're like me, you are super tired. So I appreciate that you took the time to be here, because if it weren't my talk, it'd be hard-pressed to get me somewhere at 9:30 in the morning. Hello everyone. I am Tara, and today we're going to be talking about Evolve and Adventure in Accessibility Retrofitting. So basically, I always say, and I tell people this over and over, that you should always consider accessibility from the very beginning of a project, but what happens when you don't? And that's what this session is about. So if you want, you can also follow me on the Twitter. It's right down there at the bottom, in case you have a question we don't get to, and you want to ask me later. But fair warning, my Twitter account is mostly pictures of cats and beer. All right, so about me, I've worked on some stuff. I always think these slides are kind of silly because it's like, why you should listen to me on this subject. But basically, I've been in the video game industry for about 9 years, mostly working at AAA studios on stuff like Saints Row 2, Evolve, obviously, BioShock Infinite, Red Faction Guerrilla. But I've also been in game accessibility for 8 years, starting with Able Gamers, later becoming the chairperson of the IGDA Game Accessibility SIG, where I championed some cool stuff. And then just last Monday, there was the first ever Game Accessibility Conference, hashtag GAConf, and I was the co-chair or co-director, whatever you want to call it, of that conference. So that's you know, I guess I've done work in this field, just trust me, I promise I'm not lying to you. So in this presentation, what are we going to be talking about today? So step one was, how did we evaluate our accessibility after the fact? What did we eventually do to make our game more accessible? What did we learn during this process? And how can you just take what we did, use that knowledge to make your projects better and not make the same mistakes we did? So obviously the first question was, how well did we do? And something interesting about asking that question is you have to have a benchmark to grade yourself against. And we didn't actually have one. So although there are plenty of guidelines out there on how you should develop an accessible game, there isn't really like a scorecard to check your game against. So that's where we started. We made one. So we took the guidelines that were published at gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, the includification guidelines by Able Gamers, the special effect wish list, and then all of the recommendations by the IGDA Game Accessibility SIG, and we combined them into a giant feature list, of course moving duplicates because there were some, and kind of starting off that. In the end, we had about 150 unique accessibility action items that we could check against to see if we had done it or not. So once we basically had this giant list of features, we know not all features are created equal. So we evaluated each feature for a few different things. So number one was its reach, or the number of people it would benefit. The next one was the impact, so the difference it would make to the people it reached. And then the cost. Now when we considered the cost, we did that in the amount of effort that would have been needed if we had done it originally. Not what the cost of retrofitting it was, but if we had planned for it from the beginning, how hard would this to have been implemented? And it was really convenient to get this list sort of together and organized in that fashion, because most of the lists, particularly the game accessibility guidelines and includification, are kind of already bucketed in the same way. And based on this information, we placed each of the different features into a tier, and we assigned it a point value. So something basic would be like subtitles. Just having subtitles, really basic feature, really easy to do. 3 points, but having subtitles that have optional letterboxing, multiple size value, repositioning options, a lot more work, but make the subtitles a lot better, 10 points. So it's kind of how much work did you put in for this? So we went through item by item, and we awarded points for fully met goals, partial goals for partial implementation, or subpar implementations, like technically we meet this requirement, but it's not a good user experience. 0 points for just not having anything, or marking it as not applicable if it didn't work for us. So for example, if there was a guideline on how to do voice activation, we didn't have that, so we weren't going to ding us for not having something related to that. So what was our overall score? We ended up having like 64%, so that's a D. Not exactly a great score. Some would say it's near failing, actually. So obviously we had a lot of room for improvement. So we needed to figure out where to start, and so we started going through the report card and looking for those basic items first to see where to start and what could be an easy win. And the key points we're looking to see, like I said, if there were any of those basic features that were missed. And then we went through and started collecting player feedback. So one of the areas we really looked for was in our forums and seeing what players were already saying that they wanted and kind of cross-checking those two things to see if there was something that, oh, this would be easy and it's already something that players are requesting a lot. So once we identified the list of features, we started scoping out the work and set our plan into motion. So what was the first thing we did? Actually, one of the most requested features for game accessibility was amazingly simple, and it had next to no cost. Gamers with disabilities often do not know if they can play a game until they buy it and bring it home, open it. And this is due to the lack of information about the accessibility features contained within the title. This information normally isn't made public. So again, it puts these gamers with disabilities in the situation that they've bought something that now they're stuck with because they can't return it. I guess you could trade it into GameStop for like $5, but that's not exactly a great value proposition. So all of the references, every list we looked at just asked for this. So we grabbed the game accessibility icon, this little controller wheelchair guy, which is available from one switch for just Creative Commons use as long as you're denoting game accessibility information. And we made a simple online post, and we also posted this in our forums, that was just a factual list. We state what features we had, the options associated with those features, and we were honest about what our title didn't have. So pretty early on, we decided that we would rather be open about our game's features, and if we didn't have something, be honest about it, and hope that in the future we could be better, and maybe even deter someone from buying our title in some cases, rather than having them buy it and go through that experience where they just spent their money on something they can't use. I was talking to one of the co-founders, Phil, and kind of advocating on why we should do this, and he was like, yeah, no, we need to put that information out there. Not doing it would just be shitty. So it was very nice to get that kind of buy-in, because I don't know if you guys have ever been at a studio like that where you don't say anything that could stop someone from buying your title. So it was very refreshing to be someplace that was honest and didn't want to have a gamer buy something they couldn't use. So the next feature we actually got as like one of the #1 requested things out of the forums, and it also fell into the basic category on our list, was being colorblind friendly. So one of the things we quickly realized was we had a lot of UI elements that were using color only to identify the state of things. So one example was our ping system, which used red or green circles based on what you were pinging or marking. And the fix with this was really simple, and it actually inspired us to make the ping system much more useful. So we ended up using a series of symbols to denote what wildlife was what. So you can see on the example on the left, the monster, instead of a red circle, now has a paw print icon. This plant that's going to eat you now has an exclamation mark. I don't remember what I was pinging on the far right, but that was something friendly, so it just has the less scary paw print icon. So we were able to make things more recognizable and give people more information, and all of a sudden, this section was now colorblind friendly. So something else that we noticed was in our game, if you were looking at player names, that was how you could identify what class someone was in if you just didn't know the characters. And we realized that the names were just colors. So if you can't tell the difference between the colors, you don't know what class that person is in, unless you're super knowledgeable about the game. So with that one, we ended up doing something really simple. We ended up just placing all of the icons with the above the names, so that if you had colorblind mode turned on, these icons would appear and you could tell the difference. But we actually had some larger problems. Now, I know the screenshot is probably a little blurry, but I liked it because it showed one of our larger problems. We had several in-game visual effects that would either display the state on color, which was one problem, but it was compounded with this problem, and it was some visual effects were just getting lost in game completely. So here, for someone who is red-green colorblind, this red icon in the green swamp would just get lost. So we knew early on that adding a color filter was not the right answer. So colorblind issues, number one, only applied to certain visual effects, not everything, not the entire game. And furthermore, adding a colorblind filter could fix the problem, but it would also make the game really, really ugly, and it could potentially shift other colors that weren't a problem into a problem state. So we knew that was not going to be what we wanted to do, but we still had to deal with this in some way. This was obviously still a problem. So what we ended up doing was making an additional 3 version of that visual effects that the player would select before loading into the game. And yeah, so let that sink in. That's right. For the features we found causing issues with colorblindness, we ended up with 4 separate versions of that effect. The one we shipped with, and then 3 additional ones for the most common types of colorblindness. So obviously, the cost of retrofitting colorblind mode for us was extraordinarily high. It literally quadrupled the work of some of the visual effects. But we knew this was something that we needed to be aware of going forward, and we kind of made it our internal goal to not introduce anything new, because we were still releasing hunters, monsters. We didn't want to introduce a new character that would need to be hooked up into the system. So in my screenshot here, I really like this screenshot because you can see that, like I said, when we turned on colorblind mode, it's not changing everything in game. It's only changing these problem visual effects. So the only thing that's different are the footprints on the left and the targeting reticule in the middle. So this is really important. There are people who do colorblind mode wrong all the time. So I really, just let this soak in, absorb it. If you learned something about colorblind mode today, it's that please don't do a filter, just address the problem areas. Now, like I said, we ended up being smart, and basically starting at the concept phase, we would tell if a visual effect was going to be a problem in colorblind mode. So if a gun had 2 different states, like charging and ready to fire, but the concept art looked like the picture on the left, we knew that wasn't going to fly, and we'd just send that straight back. But if it had a other visual difference, something other than color, a second way of displaying that information, like the one on the right, we knew that that was going to work, that was good. We could use that one, and then we'd actually go about building the visual effect. So in the end, we did have several additional updates to colorblind mode after the initial patch that contained it. We updated even more UI elements, and we caught things such as in-game outlines to make them also part of the system. And the class icon fix that I mentioned previously, that ended up being so popular, we had non-colorblind players using colorblind mode so that they could see that icon. So in the end, we actually pulled that out of colorblind mode, made it its own toggle that was on by default. So, that just goes to show accessibility features will be used beyond your core player base and makes games better for everyone. So the next one we decided to tackle was remappable controls. So although we had remappable keyboard controls on PC, we didn't have anything for the controller, meaning that console players were left completely without the ability to remap. This was a highly requested feature and incredibly helpful for gamers with various impairments, or if they were using a specialty controller that didn't work with our out-of-the-box control schemes. So what was interesting for me personally while I was digging into this feature and kind of pushing it to get made was I learned at one time this feature had actually been in development, but it ended up being cut. Although there was a couple people who had championed it previously, they had kind of attempted to simply duplicate the system that was on PC onto console. And it led to a kind of buggy design. And the result was a system that really wasn't worth the effort, and so it got cut. Now, once we decided that, no, we're going back, we're going to do this right, is something we need to tackle, we actually took inspiration straight from a previous GDC talk of mine, which I'm sure you all saw, No More Excuses, Your Guide to Accessible Design, and we implemented the button swap method. Now, although I'm sure you all saw it, let me go ahead and refresh your memory on what that was. So we offered the player different preset control schemes. So Evolve actually shipped with 5 different control schemes for hunters and 4 for monsters that the player could choose from. So the next part of this process is making sure the control schemes group different actions together. So if you look at this one, you can see that action reload is grouped together on the left, and then on the right, action use cover is grouped together, and that's what I'm talking about when grouping things together differently. So this mixture of actions, not just rearranging the buttons, allows for the player more customization when they're trying to remap their controls. So once the player decides on what control scheme they want, the player is simply just given the option to switch what's mapped between 2 buttons. So everything that's with that button goes with it. So it's not like, oh, I want use cover to move with action, but reload stay there. No, you'd have to find another control scheme that offered that pairing. I know a lot of people get like, Tara, my button Y does like 6 things. Just have everything that goes with Y move in this method. So for getting this in and getting this tested on Evolve, it was actually really easy. We avoided a lot of the pitfalls of remappable controls because we already had a remapping system on PC. So our UI was already set up to be able to update. We already had the UI elements for all of these icons already available. We had like one small thing where like a monster scheme and hunter scheme had something that was shared on controller, but we just had to split that, and that was pretty much all we had to do. The largest loss of work was the first time someone tried to do it and it actually got cut. Now, so this is a system for us that had very little overhead in terms of getting it implemented. But as I was saying previously, if we didn't already have a PC remapping available and we didn't already have all that art ready with UI, this could have been something that would have been way more expensive to add in after the fact. So these 2 features were the first accessibility patch that we actually got launched. Sorry, excuse me. And we decided that we were just going to roll out the accessibility features in chunks as they were ready, rather than waiting for like the game to be 100% accessible, because that'll never happen anyway. So in our weekly live stream, we took time to educate our audience on, number 1, the idea of what game accessibility is and why it was important. And not why just it was important to us as developers, but to us as gamers. And we showed off all the features and told players how they could provide additional feedback, requests, and we really opened the door for accessibility conversations with our players. We wanted it to be a dialogue. So the accessibility portion of our live stream lasted over 30 minutes of Evolve's weekly live stream on the Twitch channel, which has over 23,000 followers. And it was also hosted by the Turtle Rock Twitch channel. So I got to be on there. I was really excited. I didn't, there aren't many live streams that highlight accessibility. So for me personally, it was a big day. But obviously, we didn't just stop at 2 separate features. Around this time, we were actually getting ready for the launch of Evolve Stage 2, which was the free-to-play relaunch of the game. And we wanted to make the game even more accessible. So we ended up having a big update on our visual effects. One of the things that became very apparent was there was a lot, like a literal shit ton of things happening in our game. There were 4 different guns that could be fired. There were area attacks, monster attacks. There were wildlife. And some of it was very, very obtrusive and often happening simultaneously. And so to be honest, a lot of these visual effects were not only making it difficult for players with visual impairments, it was just hard for players in general. So we took this approach at overhauling the visual effects, and we updated almost half of them with the goal of clarity, less noise, and defined borders. So if you look at this example, this is Hyde firing his flamethrower in a toxic grenade cloud. And the before and after is drastic. In the left, you don't even know what he's firing at. So obviously, these were big changes. But, these changes were across the board. So if you look at this screenshot, you can see the before and after of Kraken's aftershock. aftershock. Before, it was a completely fuzzy vortex, but after the redesign, it had a well-defined and high-contrast edge that allowed players to know where the end of this was, what was the hit zone. And this actually helped relieve a major problem that we had been experiencing. So only players who played against Kraken all the time, who were really experienced, knew how far you had to dodge to avoid getting hit. You just had to know before these changes went in. So now that it had a defined border and a clear outline that was easy to see, all players, even new players, knew where they needed to go to get out of the way. And as I mentioned previously, we often had multiple complex visual effects happening simultaneously, and sometimes they would stack and stick. So another thing we did was to help this was develop a unified language for all of our visual effects to make them similar, so you had a better idea of what was happening, where it was going to happen, so we didn't have too much happening in one place. And much like with the concept art in dealing with colorblindness, we had a very similar approach on making sure we weren't doing things that were going to be too busy or might cause new conflicts and become a problem going forward. So one thing that also became clear to us was, although our tutorials allowed for a safe space for the player to learn the controls without dying, it wasn't a good representation of seeing if the player actually understood the game, the cues around them, or even just how to play. So originally, we only offered Goliath and Markov tutorials, and later we expanded them to include these hunt tutorials, which were basically advanced tutorials. Each one catered to a specific character in that class who we determined was sort of the best starter character for that group, the one that was normally the easiest to use. And these tutorials allowed for everyone to get a better grasp of the basics before moving on. And it was a space that the player could take their time and adjust to any class without pressure and helpful guidance. So in our original tutorials, let's say we had a gamer with a specialty controller who was trying to see if they could, use their controller to play. They couldn't learn that from our original tutorials because it wasn't really playing. It was, you are here, press A to jetpack there. Not a very good representation. So with these advanced tutorials, it was much better for someone trying to understand if they could play or trying to learn to play. Now, these tutorials were actually one of the most complex things we ended up retrofitting. It was a great experience for us as devs, though. So not only, number one, did we have to see if we actually understood how to play our game, we had to teach how to play it to others. We ended up actually having to develop a new audio queuing system to ensure the most important VO, which was the voiceover from Abe and Kyra, who were leading you through this tutorial. Make sure they were heard above other noises. We also had to develop a priority system for the subtitles because we also didn't want them to get stomped out by less important systemic lines. Like if Kyra was telling you something important about how to fight this monster, we didn't want Hank saying reloading to push her subtitle off screen. So, and this also was, heavily scripted and just required a lot of man work to get done. So this was something that doing it after the fact and trying to teach players, how to do this afterwards was pretty high. So another one of our largest efforts was actually updating our in-game UI and having it match the existing visual effects. So basically, there could be a disparity. A UI element could be a blue bar on a health thing, but a green cross in the world. So you may not realize that was telling you the same information twice. And we also found out that we had a ton of in-game occurrences that were either sound-based and sometimes so subtle that players, even without hearing impairments, just didn't know that they existed. Or the UI was so subtle or lacking contrast that they were overlooked and frequently just unused. So we took efforts to double down on communicating a lot of this information. And this included being poisoned, healing, the defense matrix is shown here. So previously, like if someone was being shielded, they would have a little bar on top of their health bar. But here, as you can see, the visual effects, boom, it's right on top of the character. It's a lot easier to see. And also, if you had a defense matrix on you, I should have got a better screenshot now that I think of it, but on the left, you can see you have that same icon showing up for you. So it looks the same, the visuals are the same, they're bolder, they're a lot easier to see. And we also did this for, shielding, fire damage. But beyond this, we also took steps to make a lot of other things visually clear. So visual tells like, dead carcasses. So if a monster killed a wildlife and went on his way, that carcass would be there to let you know that the monster had gone this way. But if you couldn't notice the carcass, obviously that's not helpful. So we ended up putting outlines on them so you could see them more clearly. We also did the same thing for elite wildlife. They had like a tower of light because they offered you buffs if you kill them. So you want to kill them, but if you can't find them, it doesn't do you any good. And then we also added new UI for major gameplay events such as teammates dying, being revived, that kind of thing. So of course you can't add UI elements for everything. That would be terrible. So we also decided to put an in-game announcer who was capturing a lot of these events. So if something was there visually, but maybe not strong, wasn't something we thought should have a UI element, the VO of the announcer could help reinforce that and display that information in a second way. And like I said, we just kind of went crazy. Like we got all sorts of new UI things. So we had the ping that changed, now all of a sudden, if you're harpooned, you get an icon for that, stuff that, again, we had a lot of things that we just kind of expected players to figure out. Like at one point we updated how Behemoth's armor worked, and no one knew what was happening. So we ended up adding information for that. We're telling you when your dropship's coming. Really, it was just, there was a lot of information we realized that if you just didn't know it, then you're not going to get it from in-game anywhere. So that was a lot of what we were doing. But one of the other things we realized, and I think that kind of goes in tandem, is Evolve had a difficulty problem. We found that our gameplay was frequently inaccessible, and if one player were underperforming, as it were, it could ruin the experience for the entire team and put them in a situation where they couldn't recover. It was creating this extraordinarily toxic, get good kind of community, which obviously wasn't what we wanted. So one of the things we did was change our gameplay to more evenly distribute these gameplay tasks, make it so that more people could take a chance at doing some of this stuff. So it meant that if there's a struggle for a certain player with a particular class, the team could balance it out and still have a chance at winning. We wanted to create gameplay that was inclusive, where a whole team could work together rather than punish new or inexperienced players or a player who was struggling because they weren't good at a particular class. And we ended up changing a lot. We reworked 3 of the major class abilities, which are kind of like, staples in the game. So for me, the best example of this is the mobile arena, or as players just called it, the dome. So it originally could only be thrown by the trapper, and the trapper would have to throw it to where they thought the monster was going to be. So for some players, such as myself, being a trapper was legitimately stressful. So I personally lacked both the skill and reflexes to capture the monster. I was known for throwing domes and catching absolutely nothing in them. And it had a significant recharge time, so once I threw that dome, missed the monster, well, we all have to hang out for another 2 minutes till I get to try again, at which point I'd probably still miss the monster. So we changed it for stage 2, so that all classes could throw the dome. And even better, when you went to throw the dome, it came down automatically over the monster. So now anyone could throw it, and you were guaranteed to capture the monster. We had to make some changes to how the dome worked once you capture the monster because of that, but it was still so much better. So for myself and a lot of other people, the class went from something we literally dreaded to something that was new and exciting to explore. And some of the characters even got more than one class change. So with Behemoth, we actually took time to not only redo his abilities, we fixed tons of long-standing bugs. He basically got a full refactor. But we did some other stuff, like tinkering with how our aim assist worked, changing our controls on our, what's the right word, like the sensitivities on our controller to make it better. I mean, we just went like ham. I've never worked on another project that basically took so many core tenets of gameplay and we're like, fuck it, doing it live. Again, patching every week, we're crazy people. But it was all better, and it made a lot of improvements. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in many cases, gamers with disabilities don't know if they can play a game until after they buy it, and at which point they'll find out it doesn't work. And that's why it was so important for us to publish that list of game accessibility features that we had. But in-game, after we went free-to-play, we had a similar problem. So now anyone could download the game, anyone could play for free, but you could still spend either real money or in-game currency to unlock new characters, unlock new perks. And again, we really had no way for any particular player to know if they liked that character or if they could even use that character or that perk without that initial investment. So again, we wanted to give the players this information. So for us, we figured the best way to do this was just remove the problem by implement a try before you buy system for all characters and perks. So the player is actually able to go into single player and play anything, any of the characters, any of the perks, as much as they wanted for no cost to them. They could go in, see if they liked it before they spent their money. And obviously, playing in single player isn't quite the same as playing in multiplayer. So we also offered free characters on rotation every week so that players could try these new characters that they didn't own in multiplayer as well as single player. So something else that was really fun was for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is in May every year. We saw Uncharted 4's awesome video that they released about their game accessibility features as part of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And basically, I got super jealous because I was like, we've done accessibility work. This isn't fair. Why does Naughty Dog get an awesome video? So I was like, we should do something. We should do something right now. So literally, right then, we're like, what we can do? We can do a stream. And so we didn't even go to we have a streaming area with a proper green screen and all that stuff. We didn't even do that. We rocked a whiteboard up behind my desk and erased it, put a camera on my desk. We're doing it here. We're doing it right now. So yeah, we just did a Global Accessibility Awareness Day stream about Evolve just straight from my desk in the office. So on the stream, we talked about some of the changes that were due to be released in our next big update, which were some of the things that I've kind of talked about up to this point. And we talked about some other changes that were going to be coming up as well. And what was really great was the amount of people who showed up to the stream, and very few of them are actually gamers with impairments. They were just gamers who were excited to learn. The stream was also a great opportunity for us. Our, again, low budget at my desk stream with a whiteboard as the background got picked up by a few blogs who were rounding up the news for the day for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And so we got exposure through accessibility that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. And we also announced 2 other features that at the time didn't have a cemented ship date that were still in the works. Now, one of these features were closed captions. This was a feature we actually started developing way back at the same time as remappable controls and colorblind mode, but it didn't get done in time for the first patch. And although hooking up the system to give the options of subtitles or closed captions was done really quickly without many issues, the major stumbling block was actually what sounds should be triggering a cue. What sounds do we have in game that are actually really important to gameplay? So along with the engineer who built the system, I took a stab at making a first draft of list of what sounds I thought were important and should be triggered with the system. So once I had the list, I brought it over to our balance group. So our balance group was comprised mostly of QA that we had hired out of the competitive community that would make sure that when we made changes, we weren't breaking our game at a super high level. And they knew how to properly utilize, every cue in game. So I brought it to them. And here's an accurate rendition of how our conversation went. Hey guys, look, I have this list of awesome game accessibility things that should trigger sound. Can you give it a once over? I'm sure it's perfect. Tara, you left spotters off the list. I have no idea what you're talking about. Tara, don't you know, spotters make a noise when they hear the monster. No, I didn't know that. So Although I will admit, I don't have the best hearing, I had no idea that that sound was even in-game. And that was just one of the many sounds I learned in-game that meant something that I had no clue about. So this kind of coupled with UI changes I mentioned earlier were just another way we had information that wasn't getting to not just our core players, but especially those who had impairments. What ended up happening with this was at the same time we were trying to identify the sounds, we had started making a lot of these crazy gameplay adjustments. So we ended up holding off till after the adjustments were made and seeing what new UI we were adding before we went to put sounds on the closed caption system, so we could kind of wrap our head around, what wasn't being reinforced in some way. Unfortunately, this was a feature that never shipped. It was still in progress when Turtle Rock's contract ended with 2K for Evolve. But it was something that I was personally really excited about, so I was pretty bummed when it didn't get out. So the other one was the comm wheel. So one of the things that had become very, very apparent was if you weren't using a mic or couldn't use a mic, our game was nearly impossible to play. Communicating with your teammates and other players was key. So sure, on PC, you had in-game text chat, but number one, that wasn't always fast enough. If you're in the middle of a fight, like hitting enter to type stuff, like not very efficient. And there wasn't actually any way to do that on console at all. So if you're on console, there was no way for you to talk to your other players if you didn't have a mic. So we started developing a comm wheel. So this is the original concept art. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get an in-game screenshot of what it ended up looking like. But it was fairly true to this. Basically, our goal was identify the most important things you need to tell your teammates. I'm down, we should group up, that kind of stuff, like heal me, blah, blah, blah. And once you triggered it, it would have some sort of in-game visual effects. So for example, if you wanted to say group up here, a little visual effect popped up in the world to show you where you wanted to group up. Honestly, the largest problem we encountered was trying to have a comm wheel that nicely integrated with both platforms in terms of controlling it. Since we'd used so much real estate on the controller, particularly already for everything that you could do, and we had play tested it. We're still kind of tweaking it to make it a truly great usable experience. And also around that time was when our contract ended with Evolve. So this was another thing that was in progress that didn't get to ship, but we were pretty excited about it. So what should you learn about Turtle Rock and Evolve's adventure and accessibility retrofitting? So some of the things we implemented weren't that much work to add them in after the fact, but some things that should have been stupid simple, like colorblind mode, ended up being huge endeavors. But none of the stuff would have been that difficult or hard if we had just thought about it early in development. If one person had mentioned it or kept track of it, maybe we wouldn't have made so many mistakes to begin with. So I know this doesn't sound like an actual lesson, but apparently it is worth repeating. Pre-production is the time to think about accessibility. Doing accessibility from the beginning is not expensive. Retrofitting accessibility can be incredibly costly. Please don't do it. The other thing we learned is you know your game. You know how your game works. But to really understand how players engage your game, you need playtests with people who do not work on your project. At minimum, they should be on a different project, friends or family. People from outside your studio who don't know your game like you do. Get some user research up in there, up in that business. So we knew how to play our game, but we needed to see if other people did. One of the things that I was also really jealous of, this talk should be subtitled Tara, Jealous of Naughty Dog. We didn't have the resources to do it, but one of the things that Naughty Dog did when they were putting in their game accessibility features was they actually had gamers with different physical impairments come in and test it. That was something that I would have loved for us to have the time and resources to do. So if you get that chance, do it. Another thing was a lot of the changes that were massively beneficial to gamers with disabilities weren't always even proposed for accessibility reasons. They just happened to have a huge impact for these gamers while improving the experience of the core audience. Most accessibility features fell into this category. We didn't implement a single accessibility feature that hurt the core audience. That's something that I have to fight all the time. I get told, oh, but no one will use this. The core gamers won't like it. That's just absolutely not true. So don't think that. That's bad. And lastly, our accessibility efforts wouldn't have been nearly as successful if we hadn't told people about them and got buy-in from our community. So we shared this information on our live streams, our forum, our social media accounts, and we created a dialogue with our players, and we created an avenue to get feedback from them. We became more connected with our player base. And really the coolest thing about this was we created our own little army of accessibility advocates out of our players. So users in our forum, they were helping other players find what they need. The forum members were tagging devs and being like, hey, did you see so-and-so's request? I think this falls under accessibility. Or in some cases, they would want a feature and ask us, hey, I was interested in this. Would this also help someone with an impairment? And that's awesome. They were getting empathy for these other gamers. I mean, even today, they still tweet at me cool accessibility stories, or if they see it in the news, and they share it with me, and they're excited about helping more gamers game. And like, I actually have something to back this up. So one of the coolest things that happened was Shara, which is Shane and Tara, really official, sponsoring hashtag GAConf, or the Game Accessibility Conference that happened for the first time last Monday. So at Turtle Rock, the now community marketing manager and I, Shane, we would just stream us playing video games and making mixed drinks after work on Tuesdays. And collectively we became known as Shara. And Shane and I were both working at the Game Accessibility Conference. And at the time, we were still doing fundraising for the conference, and we decided it would be awesome to try and raise money to become a bronze level sponsor on our goofy-ass Tuesday Twitch stream. So we brought it up one day, and within an hour, we had raised the funds. So these names on the right, they are just Twitch users, with the exception of Mommy Au Pair, who's my mom, who decided that they loved games, and they want everyone to be able to play games, and they put their money towards the cause. And so by talking about accessibility with your community, they'll grow as people, they'll get empathy, and it comes down to gamers want to play games, gamers want other people to be able to play games, and for us, like I said, they literally put their money behind us to help us teach other game developers how to become more accessible and help everyone. So, all right, you may be interested at this point on doing your own accessibility adventure. So I was going to go ahead and go over in a little bit more detail what we use to make our report card. So the first one is includification, which is done by a really popular charity for disabled gamers here in the US called Able Gamers. And you can download it as a PDF, or they just have their website. For me, what's really nice about this is it gives you empathetic stories. So they'll be like, hey, here's a feature, but then they'll also either give you a real life scenario of like, oh, I see that you are trying to ban this type of third-party feature in your game. Well, let me tell you a story of how, because of another studio doing that, this girl with cerebral palsy was no longer able to play her game because it was flagged as cheating software. So it gives you lots of heartfelt examples on why some of these features matter. It also has some great letters from the community and other game developers to really, if you need emotional validation on why the work you're doing is good, this is a great list. So the other one we used was the Game Accessibility Guidelines. This is actually the one I prefer because I don't need that stuff. I just want a straight list of, do you have this? Who did it best? Who did it wrong? Let me learn. So this is it's just gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. It was put together by tons of different accessibility advocates that, like I said, they work together. It is a living document. They updated it fairly regularly with either new examples, new cases, new best case examples. And like I said, this is one that I reference all the time. So the other one was the IGDA, Game Accessibility Special Interest Group. They have a set of guidelines. This one is a little bit more, the other ones have been more recently updated, but it's still really good. What's really awesome about the IGDA Game Accessibility website is they have an awesome resource page that links out to tons of places to get additional information. But you can also just email they have an email list, and if you have a question, I want to do this, I'm not sure how, you will within 2 days get 10 responses from other accessibility people who will either point you in the right path, give you the resources you need, tell you how to do it. It's a great tool to find people who can help you. Now the other thing I did is if you go to this terrible long URL, sorry, that's just what Google did when I published the document. You can actually go and download the scorecard that we used if you want to have your own scorecard. So it's pretty easy. On the left, we have the item. If I could link easily to one page, I did. The available points, what type of implementation you had, and then the awarded points. It does some formulas and spits out a number at the end. So I'll leave this up for another second so you can take a screenshot because that URL is terrible. And that's really it. So I'm going to take some questions. I'm also going to remind you right now to please fill out your surveys and tell everyone how great I was. And so yeah, there is a microphone right here. So if anyone has questions, you can come up and ask it. And yeah, so let's take some questions. What do we got? Come on.
All right.
Here we go.
I guess so. What feature did you most want to put in that for whatever reason, at a time, budget, whatever, you just couldn't?
I think for me personally, it really was the closed captions, especially since with the, Turtle Rock did the original Left 4 Dead, and it had closed captions, and it was one of the first games that was kind of recognized by the accessibility community as having closed captions. So that was one that I was always really sad didn't go out because, Turtle Rock had kind of set this benchmark of, hey, we have closed captions, and then unfortunately, Evolve didn't. So it was both needed, and I had an emotional investment of wanting to get it out. So I was sad that it didn't.
Hi, first-time caller, long-time fan. What can platforms be doing, and what can middleware be doing to help make this process of adding accessibility to your titles easier?
So I was actually just talking with some of my friends at Ready at Dawn at the Oculus party last night, and they came up to me and they were like, Tara, I really, really love that there's the backup of platform-level remapping, but they want an easy way. So if a player does want to remap their controls, they would love to have a way to basically read, I don't know, maybe some sort of API or something that's like, this player wants their controls remapped to be like this, and the game to just be able to look at that file and load it up and do it that way. So I think there is a craving for hey, if they're using these accessibility features on the console level, let me as a game look at that stuff or look at that stuff more easily so that I can mirror those same choices they're making at a platform level in my game. Yes, what do we got?
So in terms of convincing your studio to make good choices about accessibility, did you have a really compelling source of stats or anything about player accessibility needs or disabilities?
Yeah, so I did, and it was actually really funny. So with Turtle Rock, when I went to convince them that we should be doing it, I had a whole presentation together. So 22% of Americans have an impairment that could affect the way they game. And I had all these stats ready, and I was like, yeah, and a lowballing estimate is 9% of players are colorblind. And I put together a 20-page deck, and I was like, we got this. And I was on slide 2 And Chris and Phil were like, we just want to be good people and have people play our game. And I was just like, no, but I worked really hard. Like I've got transitions. Like, can we just go through it? Like I have this star wipe in here I'm really proud of.
Use the star wipe. That you're so lucky, I've got to say. Like, because sometimes you need to like convince them, basically.
Yeah. Well, every other time that I'd gone to have that battle, I think the fact that I called it a battle shows how it went. And which was why I prepped this whole talk before I even went to talk to them, because I assumed I would have to go in like, here's the business case, here's why it makes sense, here's how we can reach a broader audience and improve our core players' experience. And Turtle Rock were just like, no, we're nice. Good people, let's not be shitty.
What? Yeah, that's great. Any source that you would use if they were harder to convince? Like, where would you go to find good player disability stats from now on platforms?
Ian Hamilton's Twitter account.
Hey, Ian. I've been looking for him, actually. We used to work together. Yeah, we worked together.
Yeah.
Doing stuff.
Yeah, no, just ask Ian.
Yeah. No, I'm too intimidated by him. Right, cool. Thanks for.
Yeah, but I think you can also get a lot of that information in the guidelines that I mentioned earlier. They're kind of peppered throughout. The IGDA website does have some of that basis information, or like I said, Ian Hamilton _ on Twitter. He just posts relevant articles all the time. So there you go. Follow Ian on Twitter.
Hi. I was wondering, how did you balance making, you have all these UI elements for accessibility, but how do you balance having an intimidating UI versus an accessible one?
Yeah, that was something that it was hard for us because it wasn't so much intimidating for us as cluttered, because we had a lot of things happening. For us, it was, the big question really became, does this need to be UI, or is there another way that we can reinforce this? So like sometimes instead of a UI element, it became a visual effect. Sometimes, it became something we would add a sound for, but ensure that it was captured in subtitles. So we did kind of go about the process of identifying key things that were being missed, and then adding them first, and then sort of stuff more on the periphery. We really looked to see, does this need to be UI, or can we give this information in a different way? And just, play testing, like, is this too much? Is this too intrusive? Do players understand it? That kind of thing.
Thank you.
Hi. Did you make any changes based on players with epilepsy, by chance?
We did, actually. We cut the intro trailer. So we found out after we had shipped, and this was only for Evolve Stage 2 since it didn't get brought over to consoles. We actually got contacted by, I am blanking on her name, but a woman in the UK who, I don't know how it happened, but she had run parts of Evolve through I just forget the name of the test that shows if you have patterns that could trigger epilepsy. And we found out in the very beginning sequence that Markov with his lightning gun, it actually hit that pattern. And so we just cut it, which worked out great anyway, because we were like, oh, we need a lower install. And so like, great, here, yeah, let's get rid of this video anyway. It could cause seizures. And after that, it was definitely something that we were more aware of. Like, I'm going to be honest, even as an accessibility person, I frequently forget to consider epilepsy. But yeah, that was the main change that we made. For some reason, the in-game version wasn't hitting it. It was like something about this pre-rendered cutscene specifically that could cause problems with epilepsy.
Thank you.
Thanks for that talk. So my question is, beyond subtitles and UI, were there any other common feature requests from deaf gamers?
The comm wheel was the other big one. The fact that there wasn't a way to communicate with other players if you couldn't hear them on console. Like I said, on PC it wasn't so bad because there was the text chat, but in the event of like quick action, it's not like, oh my god, there's a monster, let me hit enter and start typing. That's not as good, which was why we wanted to get the comm wheel out so bad, so we could allow for quick communication for people who couldn't hear or even talk with other players. So really the comm wheel.
Okay, so there wasn't much feedback in terms of getting flashes or bass sounds?
No, but I think it was mostly because, like I said, there was so much information that even core gamers didn't realize were being transmitted by sound that people didn't know. People didn't know that they didn't have the information. So obviously, like, deaf gamers weren't hearing about things they didn't know because the core gamers didn't know, which is a problem in and of itself. I think if more players had realized how much more information we'd been given by audio alone, I think there would have been an increase, like, you know, like, you could hear the monster sniff, like if the, monster was looking for the hunters, and you were a hunter, you could hear that. And it was so quiet that, like, that was another thing that I was like, oh, that's an audio cue we have in game? I had no idea. So like I said, I think if more core gamers had knew the kinds of sounds that gave information, I think the deaf gamers would have been more aware that they were also missing it. But we were so bad at just letting people know to begin with that there wasn't a lot of requests.
All right, great. Cheers.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm interested in the kind of the conflict between engaging your high skill cap players and the introduction of accessibility features, which could potentially be called dumbing down the game. How do you resolve that? A good example that you spoke about would be the mobile arena. Like how does that balance come into play, and how do you resolve those, that desire to provide a high skill cap for certain players?
Yeah, so what we ended up doing, so I worked a lot with the balance team directly, and we started thinking about how the range of our skilled players, and basically our goal was to, like, so if you think about, like, this is your range of skill available to players, for us step one was bringing up this bottom level. So you can still play up here if you want. You still have to know or be faster, that kind of stuff than these players down here. But we wanted the base level to be a little bit higher up. So that was really when we started thinking, it was like, how can we bring this bottom level up while keeping, people with super fast reactions or super good planning, allowing them to climb up to the top. So for example, when we changed the mobile arena so that anyone could capture the monster, like, that was when we were like, okay, well, now we have, like, a different metagame that's happening within the dome. And, like, we needed to provide an opportunity for the monster to be able to get out of it now, because he would always get domed before he could dodge. So, like, if you were a good fighter, you could get out of the dome quickly. Just kind of, like I said, like, it really for us was about bringing up the bottom players while letting the top players stay up there without taking away, if we took something away from them that would boost them up higher, giving them something to replace it, essentially.
Okay, thanks. Just as kind of follow-up, because no one's waiting. Is there, like, a communication aspect to that out to your community? Like, when you made those changes, did you receive any negative feedback from people who perceived this as a negative change? And how did you address
tons.
that?
We ruined our game.
Exactly.
We hate gamers. We hate our game. We're ruining it. We know nothing about our game. We know nothing how to play. It was really interesting. So there were, like, two camps. There was, like, the first camp that was like, oh my God, this is great. Like, now I can play with this other set of friends and, all this other stuff. And then there are still people today who are like, I'm loading up the Evolve beta branch because Classic Evolve is better. Like, there are always going to be people like that. But for us, we worked really hard to communicate the changes and why we were doing them. And we were able to win over a lot of people by just having a dialogue. I think if we had just been silent, be like, we're making these changes, we're not talking to you about it, it would have gone over super, super poorly, especially because a lot of the times we would try to explain things to them before they actually saw it. So, like, we would warn them. We were like, hey guys, we're gonna make this change. That's why we're gonna make this change. Oh my God, I hate you, stop ruining Evolve. We're like, no, we swear it's making it better. And then we would do stuff to, like, back that up. Like, we were public with our telemetry. So we were like, hey guys, so we're changing this monster because this monster, it's just not very good right now. That monster's the best monster. That monster always wins. Okay, well, looking at the telemetry, that monster only wins 16% of the time. So maybe you're just really bad. And, like, just putting that information out there so that they could see it. And like I said, explaining why we were doing things. And most of the time we got buy-in. Of course, there were some grumpy Gus's, but, they're always going to be vocal anyway.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, what were you doing about accessibility for players that don't really have like a disability, but like are really bad with observation and awareness?
So I think a lot of the changes we were making, like, so for example, the announcer was something like that. So I know I got really self-involved when I would play as Bucket. And I would frequently not pay attention to like if my teammates were dying because I was too busy having fun shooting rockets. So, you know, being able to like have the announcer there that's like, your teammate has died. And you're like, ah, shit, I should have been paying attention. You know, we also, like I said, we increased different cues and more prominent UI elements to like really put the stuff that you should pay attention to in your face. Because we found like, oh, trying to put it like subtly over here on the right, like, oh, hey, someone's down. There's a little arrow over here that's like pointing that someone's down. No, no one saw that. Like a giant thing in the middle of the screen that's like, so-and-so died. It's like, oh, okay, I can't miss that because it's right here. So for us, it was really identifying like, what should people not miss? What do they have to know? Okay, yeah, just put it in their face. They have to see it.
Thank you.
So I think I have time for like one more question, if there are any more questions. All right.
Just a simple one. So you mentioned that there was a colorblind mode. Where did you like put that in terms of selecting it, and why did you put it there?
I think we ended up putting it under visuals. I don't think. So apparently, number one, I don't remember, and I don't think we thought that hard about it. Sorry, that's not a good answer. But if I had to go back, I would love for Evolve just to have had a accessibility menu. Again, this talk should be subtitled "Terra Jealous of Uncharted." So for example, the latest Uncharted just has an accessibility menu where all of these accessibility features are in there, so you can go and look and find them in one place. Because you frequently do need to use them together. So if you're low vision and you need to, up contrast, you're probably also going to want to have your aim assist cranked up a little bit. So putting those all in one menu would make it really easy to get to in like your one-stop shop. So if I had to go back, I would love for an accessibility menu. So that's it. I am out of time. I will be drinking a tea for like 10 minutes over in the wrap-up area if you have any questions you were dying to ask me. And otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter. And please, please, please fill out your speaker surveys and let everyone know that I was awesome. Thank you.